I've been interested in this topic for a long time. Part of it is the things that happened in my childhood, but I've always been fascinated by, some people are fascinated by technology. I'm fascinated by how the mind can affect the body. And I remember watching a video a few years ago of Tibetan monks who were in a room that was roughly at freezing temperatures, and they were in their underwear, and they dipped sheets in buckets of ice water and then wrapped themselves in the sheets. And I could actually see steam rising from the sheets, and within short order, the sheets were dry. And then they would take the sheets, the dry sheets, dunk them in the ice water again, wrap themselves up, and again, the sheets would dry. And this to me is really fascinating, because how did they do it? They did it with their minds. So I'll be telling you about case studies and control trials showing a lot of evidence for the power of the mind to affect physiology. I'm going to tell you about a personal experience I had that really got me excited, because it's one thing to see videos or read about other people, but one night, the middle of the winter, peak of the flu season, I was home at night and I found myself coming down with fever, chills, extreme body ache, extreme fatigue. I knew this is the flu. And I got really angry because I couldn't afford to be laid up for 2 weeks, which is how long it usually takes to get over the flu. But it turned out that night, I was watching a karate tournament on TV that I was very excited about. And somehow, the longer I watched, the more I felt like I was actually in the tournament that night. And so you know how energized you'd be if you were in the tournament. That's how I felt throughout my body. By 2 hours later, I was all better. All my symptoms are completely gone. That was just through energizing myself. So when that happened, I realized, okay, my life is about to change, because now I realized I have the power to cure myself of illness and probably have the power to cure others. Wrong. I have tried, this was in 1991, and I've been trying ever since then. I've had pneumonia, colds, flu, everything. Arthritic flare-ups. Can't do it. Not once have I haven't been able to repeat it once. And I think the reason is that night, I wasn't trying to do anything. I was just totally energized, and it happened. And all the times I've tried since then, I've been trying to cure myself. So I'm still working on trying to figure out how I can do this without trying, because that's the key. I mean, the key is you have to know. When I go for medical appointments at UCSF, a couple of residents usually come in, med students or residents, to take my history and physical. And the first question they usually ask is, what medications are you on? And I always say to them, oh, I make my own. And they look at me like, so sometimes I think they're about to call for a psych consult, because they thought they were going to treat me for some immunological problem, and they're realizing, no, this is more of a psychiatric disorder. Or they maybe think I have a meth lab at home. I don't know what they think. But they all look really like, what do I do with this guy? What I'm really talking about, and then I explain it to them, is I'm talking about the endogenous pharmacy. The reason that pharmaceuticals work in our bodies, because we already have the receptors for those drugs. The reason we have those receptors is because we make all those drugs. So the pharmaceuticals that you get from the drugstore, those are just analogs, synthetic analogs of the physiologic drugs that are synthesized prescribed by the brain and made in the body. So we have the ability to prescribe and secrete all the drugs we need. The problem is we can only do that under ideal conditions, and that doesn't happen very often, so we need pharmaceuticals. Mariusz Verga was the medical director at the Simonton Cancer Center, where I trained for a few years, and I heard him say this and I just loved it. No drug works as fast as changing your mind, because when we change our minds, we change the drugs that are circulating in our bodies. You know this guy? I heard him say this, and I really loved it. The limits of our experience and potential are the limits of our beliefs. So if we can change our beliefs, we can change not only our physiology, but we can change our futures. We can change what we're going to succeed at. He also said this. So there are a lot of neutral events that happen to us. But when we ascribe a negative attribution to it, that leads to catabolism, or breaking down of the body. Healthy attributions lead to a building up. These are some interesting things that got published in newspapers all around the country. 1982, this young guy, Tony Cavallo, was repairing his car when it slipped off the jacks. We're talking about a Chevy Impala 64, probably weighs 3,000 or 4,000 pounds. His mother panics, and what does she do? She lifts the car off him. How is this possible? 2009, 5'7" guy lifts a sedan to help a 6-year-old girl. A few years later, a 22-year-old woman rescues her father after his car fell on him. A year ago, these two teenage girls, aged 16 and 14, lifted a 4,300-pound tractor off their father. Anyone have any ideas how they did that? Because, I mean, if any weightlifters in here? No bodybuilders? Well, you know bodybuilders. And I don't think there's a bodybuilder out there who can lift 4,300 pounds. So how do these two teenage girls do that? How does this mother lift a 3,000 or 4,000 pound car off her son? Any ideas? Yeah.
Adrenaline?
Yeah, I think so. But so it's adrenaline, it's probably other things coursing through our bodies. It would be great. Wouldn't it be great if we could do this at will? It's just, this is not the power of the body, this is the power of the mind. Because none of us in here would be able to walk outside and lift a 3,000 or 4,000 pound car. It wouldn't matter how much weightlifting we're doing. Can't do it. So the mind somehow changes the body. William James, 120 years ago, had it right. There's no clear dividing line between a person's philosophy and physiology. Bruno Bloch, in the 1920s, he was a physician in Switzerland, and patients came to see him from all over Europe who had warts. They had tried various medical treatments that failed, and he created a machine that cured warts. But the interesting thing about the machine is it looked really fancy. It shined flashing lights, different colored lights, made a lot of weird sounds. It had absolutely no therapeutic value whatsoever. All it did is made lights and sounds. It couldn't possibly cure warts. And yet thousands of patients from all over Europe came to see him. They would sit in front of this machine and their warts would get cured. Well, what cured their warts was he told them that this machine beams lethal anti-wart rays. Now, tell me another one. But they believed him. He's wearing a white coat. He's the trusted physician. They've traveled a great distance to see him because of his reputation. So by the time they get there, for maybe traveling hundreds of miles, they're just total believers. They were worshiping this guy. So he tells them it's going to cure their warts. It does. These are two guys that look pretty happy because they've just picked up a medication at the drugstore that's going to help them. But now, same two guys, they've read the side effects on the package. They don't look so happy anymore. This has a negative impact on how the drug is going to affect you. These are, if you look at the left-hand column, these are just some names of drugs, and then you look at the far right column. So the first one, it's for high cholesterol. Okay, you want to take meds for your high cholesterol, but then you read the side effect. By the way, a risk of severe muscle problems leading to kidney failure. Do I really want that? An asthma medication, but it could cause death. It might help your asthma, but you might die from it too. The third one prevents heart attack and stroke, but it could cause severe life-threatening or fatal bleeding. Okay. Hallucinations, an arthritis medication, risk of serious disorders of the skin, stomach, or intestines that could occur without warning, and also, by the way, it could cause death. When you read these side effects, it's like, wow, maybe I'm better off without the drug. Pharmaceutical companies are required by law to put this up because people really do experience these side effects. The problem is we read these side effects and talking about the power of the mind, and the power of the mind works both ways, so it doesn't always work in our favor. These are side effects not of drugs. These are side effects. Researchers have looked at a meta-analysis of placebo-controlled trials, and these are the side effects people have had from placebos, not from the drug. They didn't take the drug. They took inert sugar pills, and they got these reactions. I'm going to tell you about a Mr. Wright. The year is 1957. He's at UCLA Medical Center, dying of a very advanced metastatic cancer. And as he's in the hospital, he's only given like a couple of days left to live. That's how close to death he is. But he was able to look at the newspaper, and he discovers there's a drug being tested at a few hospitals around the country. And as one of the hospitals is where he is, UCLA Medical Center. And so he pleads with the doctors to give him this drug, but the problem is there's an inclusion and exclusion criteria to get into a clinical trial, and he didn't meet the criteria because you're supposed to have 3 to 6 months to live to get into the trial. He only had a couple of days left to live, but he pleaded with the doctors. So they figure, okay, we'll try it. We'll give him one dose. So Friday afternoon, they give him a dose, and they figure he'll be dead by Monday, and then they'll give his dose to someone who could really benefit. But his doctors were in for a surprise, because Monday morning, he was up and around, cured of cancer 2 days later. None of the other patients given this drug, carbamazepine, got any benefit whatsoever. He's up flying around in his plane 10 days after discharge, 12,000 feet with no oxygen. And he's going along great until he reads an article in the paper that carbamazepine has been found to be a worthless drug because they had these trials going on all over the country. None of them produced any results. Only one patient got better, and that's this guy, this Mr. Wright. So he reads this, and he's back in the hospital. He lost all hope. Whatever had cured him has now worked against him. This is the power of the mind. Works both ways. So his doctor makes up this ridiculous story. He says, carbamazepine really is as promising as it had seemed, but the early shipments had deteriorated rapidly in the bottles. We now have a new super refined double-strength product due to arrive tomorrow. So Mr. Wright is all excited again. He's very enthusiastic about getting the carbamazepine. Little does he know, he wasn't about to get carbamazepine again because they couldn't even give it to him, even if they wanted to, because it's no longer available. So they pretended they were giving it to him, and they gave him normal saline. This is a doctor's published account of what he said at that time. He's back up in his plane, flying around at 12,000 feet with no oxygen. This is after receiving saline solution that he believed was this magical drug that didn't cure anyone else. Until, again, the final report from the American Medical Association comes out. The final report says carbamazepine conclusively has been proven worthless, and it's just a thing of the past. This is the thing. What happens? He dies of loss of hope. Did he really die of loss of hope? He had cured himself of cancer twice. That's the thing that fascinates me about this. He was given carbamazepine on a Friday afternoon, and 2 days later, he's cured of cancer. This has been published in a medical journal. This is real. This is one of my mentors. I heard her say this once. I really loved it. So the idea is, we think thoughts are just thoughts, but they're not. They affect every cell in our body. So the next time you have a thought, every time you become aware of a thought, think about how it makes you feel. You know, if you're getting really upset all the time, depressed, anxious, filled with rage or criticism, whatever, shame, that negatively impacts our physiology and our health. There was a woman, I know it doesn't look like, you probably can't recognize this guy, but he's Deepak Chopra. Deepak Chopra wasn't always famous. Before he got on Oprah, he was unknown. He was a young endocrinologist in Massachusetts when a woman in her 50s suffering with abdominal pain came to him, and he believed after examining her that she had gallstones. So he referred her to surgery, and in these days they had this is like 40 years ago, there were no CT scans, no MRIs, no ultrasound, so they had to do exploratory surgery. So the surgeon gets in and finds widely metastasized cancer throughout her abdominal cavity, including her liver. Especially at that time, that meant you're going to die really soon. He goes out to the waiting room, explains this to the daughter, who pleads with him, please don't tell my mother, that's going to kill her. He figures she's going to be dead soon anyway. The mother's going to be dead soon anyway. I can lie to her, and that way, at least whatever time she has left is going to be a better quality of life. So he lies to the patient. He tells the patient, you just had gallstones, we removed them, closed you up, you're going to be fine. She leaves feeling great. 8 months later, she comes into the office for a follow-up visit, the picture of health, no more cancer. 2 years later, this is now 2 more years have gone by, she comes in for another follow-up, and she tells Dr. Chopra, I was so sure I had cancer 2 years ago that when it turned out to be just gallstones, I told myself I'd never be sick another day in my life. It's unfortunate doctors can't do this anymore. They can't lie to patients. It sometimes resulted in cures. But it was the mind, her mind, that cured her. There's another quote similar. These people are all saying similar things, that how thoughts catalyze changes in physiology. You don't need to know any of this. I'm putting this up just to show you that just some more evidence of what happens when you have a thought. A thought starts in the frontal cortex. That's where all thoughts start, in that part of the brain. But from there, a cascade of physiologic changes take place. So you don't need to remember it. I just wanted to show you this is what happens. Just some more evidence of what happens when you have a thought. A thought starts in the frontal cortex. That's where all thoughts start, in that part of the brain. But from there, a cascade of physiologic changes take place. So you don't need to remember it. I just wanted to show you this is what happens. The physiological effects of stress, you probably all know about this, you've all experienced it. So stress isn't just how we feel, it changes what goes on in throughout the body. There was an interesting study done in the 1950s in a small town in Roseto, Pennsylvania. Small, first-generation Italian immigrant community where people were it was a very close-knit community. And you can see they didn't take care of themselves. Chain smoked, drank, didn't exercise, ate a red meat diet that was higher in fat and cholesterol than the typical American diet, which at that time was even higher than the typical American diet today. And theirs was even higher still. They worked in mines. Levels of obesity and hypertension were equal to those in surrounding towns. The most interesting piece about this is they lived in 3, occasionally 4 generations per household, which was not unusual for the way it was in the old country. The research team, this is what they concluded. The piece that really stands out here is it's about community, social support. Everyone in this town knew everyone else on a first-name basis. They all looked out for each other. Elders weren't cast aside. They weren't put in nursing homes. They were revered. And the people there had far less disease than anywhere else. Despite their terrible health habits, they had 1/6 the heart disease of the rest of the country. The researchers came back 20 years later. They wanted to do a follow-up. Well, things had changed because the community had become upscale. It was now suburbia, typical suburbia. People drive home from work, drive into their garage. They don't know their neighbors. They don't have no clue who lives next door. The interesting thing is the people now living in this now suburban town were taking great care of themselves. They were doing everything right. But they had higher rates of heart disease and cancer. So, if you think back to people in the older community, they all knew each other, looking after each other. That's, I think, what made them healthy. It's just something to remember. This was a conversation overheard by Norman Cousins between two oncologists. So the oncologist on the left is saying, Bob, I just don't understand it. We use the same drugs, the same dosage, the same schedule, the same entry criteria, yet I got a 22% response rate and you got a 74% response rate. That's unheard of for metastatic lung cancer. How'd you do it? His answer, we're both using etoposide, platinol, oncoven, and hydroxyurea, but you call yours EPOH. I call mine HOPE. Sure, I tell them this is experimental, and we go over the long list of side effects together. He's not lying about that. But this last line, I think, is really key. He says, but I emphasize that we have a chance. You know what the most important word is in that last line? What is it? Well, I think it's we. It's we. This doctor is in there fighting with them. He's saying, I'm going to be in there with you. I'm going to be fighting with you to get you well. That is like, that you don't see that much anymore. These are the EPOH patients and the HOPE patients. There's a woman who had just finished caring. Her mother had just died from metastatic breast cancer, and she was the caregiver. And she was resolved to never have that happen to herself. So she went and got checked regularly, and sure enough, they found early stage 1 breast cancer. Now, there's nothing dangerous about stage 1 breast cancer as long as you have it taken care of. It's metastatic breast cancer that kills. So she was told, and the biopsies came back showing it's very clean margins in stage 1. And they can take care of her and she'll live a normal life. She died a few hours later. She panicked. She saw herself, she saw what happened to her mother as happening to her. She died of multiple organ failure. The doctors and nurses were just, they couldn't figure it out. But she died of multiple organ failure, probably from terror and loss of hope.
So what happens, and the doctor gave her that statement, she shifted from a defense reaction to realizing the world, it's life-threatening, and she totally shut down. And in fact, that's what happens to physiology. And so the key, I think, the lesson of this for all of us is, to what extent what someone says do we take that as a statement? Because it isn't just what the person says, it's how we process it, depending on our own backgrounds. Yeah, it's not what the doctor says, it's how we process it. And that's essentially what William Osler is saying. William Osler, when Johns Hopkins Medical School and Medical Center was first built in the 1880s, he was appointed as the first physician-in-chief. And just a side note, there was no, medical school in those days had no residency program. Imagine going to a doctor who never did a residency, they just did their medical school. That's how it was then. He put in the first residency program. But anyway, he taught his medical students and residents that, yeah, you have to diagnose the patient, but pay a lot more attention to who the patient is than the label you put on the patient. The personality characteristics of the patient are more important than the diagnosis. You can be told by a doctor, go home and get your affairs in order, you've got 3 to 6 months to live, and there are people who are going to say,
I beg to differ with you. I refuse to listen to you. And they're cured. There are other people who are told stage 1 breast cancer and they're dead. So it's who is the person, not what is the diagnosis. This guy's a cardiologist. His name is Bernard Lown, and this was a case study from the 1970s, I think. And this guy had irreparable heart damage. And he had a short time left to live. I mean, he had had a very major heart attack that totally destroyed his heart. And this is at a time when there were no heart transplants. We didn't have all the good medications we have today. There was no effective surgery. His heart was too far gone. But he overhears his cardiologist telling the medical students and residents on rounds the next morning, he hears his heart has a wholesome gallop. Now, any of you know what that means? Well, that's a good thing. Sometimes too much information is bad. He didn't know what that meant, and that served him. A wholesome gallop is a medical term for a very serious cardiac dysrhythmia. Not good. But when this patient hears his heart has a wholesome gallop, this is the image. He figures, wow, I'm as healthy as a horse. He's cured. He leaves the hospital, comes back for a checkup, and he says, "Doctor, I knew I would be fine when I overheard you telling those medical students that my heart had a wholesome gallop." How is this possible? You can't, without surgery, his heart was irreparably damaged. I don't have an answer for that. And his doctors didn't either. This is a statement about the fact that the mind affects the body and the body affects the mind. It works both ways. There was a study done, a lot of studies are done in medical school on medical students. And this one was done in a pharmacology class where the professor is teaching pharmacology. And in this study, he gives half the class stimulants, he gives the other half of the class sedatives. Or at least half the class believes they're getting stimulants. The other half of the class believes they're getting sedatives. But they weren't really given, they were all given placebos. But they didn't know this. They were told, monitor your side effects, monitor your vital signs and your symptoms. And the ones that believed, half the class gets all of the effects of stimulants. They thought they were on speed. And the other half gets all the effects of a sedative. They all had inert sugar pills. This is one of my favorite statements. The human mind is the most underutilized and poorly utilized health resource available to us. We hear everything about if you want to be healthy, eat a healthy diet, exercise, get enough sleep. We don't hear a lot about this because the mind is way more powerful. You can eat, as you saw from Rosito, Pennsylvania, they ate all the wrong things and they were healthier than other people. So they were healthier than the people 20 years later who were doing everything right. Study done in Japan, 13 high school boys had a harmless leaf rubbed on their forearms. But they were blindfolded and told. Now these 13 boys, were all selected because they had all had histories of severe reactions to a Japanese version of poison ivy, which is in this country is on the East Coast, similar to poison oak. So a harmless leaf is rubbed on their forearms, completely harmless. But they were told it's poison ivy. They all broke out the same way they would as if it was poison ivy. In the second half of the experiment, they actually rubbed poison ivy on their arms. Now, you couldn't do this today. We have IRBs, institutional review boards. Doctors can't do this. They were able to rub poison ivy on the arms, but they told them it's a harmless leaf.
and the boys were fine. This was a case where in the UK, people went to an outpatient clinic for minor things that didn't require hospitalization. And half the group were told, you have a virus and you'll be all better in a few days. So they leave feeling great, optimistic, hopeful. The other half are told, it's a mystery why you're sick, and there's no way to determine when you'll recover. Now, they weren't all that sick. People from both groups went there with just minor complaints. So the second group leaves feeling loss of hope. They're worried. Like, what does this mean? So 2 weeks later, 64% of the patients in the first group reported full recovery. Only 39% of the others reported full recovery. There was a study done where they surveyed oncologists, and they asked the oncologists, what personality characteristic do you think most lines up with unexpected recovery from cancer? And it's a great question. And these oncologists had treated a total of 100,000 cancer patients, and over 90% of the oncologists said it's hope. The patients who had hope recovered from advanced cancers. Those who didn't have hope did not recover. So it's easier said than done, though. This is the problem. How do we have hope? You know, if we don't have hope, how do we get hope? That's the tricky part. Lawrence Leshan was still is a psychologist, but he's now in his 90s. And for about 50 years, he worked using psychotherapy exclusively with people with advanced metastatic cancers. And when he was first trained, when he first started working with these cancer patients in the early 50s, he had been trained by the Freudian model, and he's doing Freudian psychotherapy with them. 100% of his patients were expected to die, and they did. 100% of his patients did die. Gradually, he starts working a little differently with them, and he starts exploring with them, well, what do you most look forward to in life? What matters to you most in life? And he started exploring with them, if we can get you better, how do you want to really spend your time? And when he did that, it went from 100% to 50% mortality rate. So people who learn to sing their own song in life. There was one guy he worked with who had been a gang member. That was his background. So Dr. Leshan is working with him. Let's see, how can we get you enthusiastic about some new line of work once we get you well? And, well, what do you do with a guy? His history, all he was the leader of a gang called the Skulls in some really rough section of New York. So they start exploring together, what career could this guy look forward to that's similar to being gang leader of the Skulls? And it turns out there is a career that lines up perfectly. Anyone imagine what that is?
CEO.
CEO? Well, yeah, I suppose there are some similarities. But I know a firefighter. Because when you think, so what does a gang do? A gang, they just hang out until there's a gang riot, a gang fight. And there's a lot of excitement. People get hurt, they get killed in the gang fight. But then they just go back and they're just hanging out some more. So what career is like that? Firefighters. Firefighters, they're called to a fire. They put out the fires. They save lives. Then they go back to the stations. They hang out until the next fire. So this guy developed hope. He realized, gee, he could do this. And he did. He became a firefighter. He fully recovered from his cancer. And until he was promoted to a desk job. He did so well. He was such a great firefighter. They promoted him, but it was a desk job, and he was miserable. His cancer came back. This is a study done in the Bay Area, Alameda County study. 7,000 residents of Alameda County were followed for 9 years. They controlled for all the usual potential confounding variables. And they discovered that the people with the highest quantity and quality of social support, friends, family, whatever, had the lowest morbidity and mortality. They had the lowest rates of sickness and death. The most socially isolated people had the highest morbidity and mortality. they did an 8-year follow-up. So they followed these people for a total of 17 years. And at the end of the 17 years, again, they found those who lived fairly isolated lives had 3 times the mortality rate of those who had family and friends. Robust inverse correlation between that and cancer. So friends are important. Friends, family, extremely important. This is something that happens, unfortunately still happens. People are given this message by their doctors and they go into a trance. And they just, it's imagine being told this, how you would feel. Most people just, they become hypnotized. They go into a trance. And the result of that is often this. So whenever I run into oncologists, I ask them, what do you tell patients? And I always suggest, if you have a patient who's diagnosed with something that has even a 98% fatality rate, instead of talking about the 98% fatality, talk about the 2% who got well, and talk about how we together as a team are going to try to do everything we can so you'll be within the 2% who can beat this disease. At least that way you're giving them some hope. There was a hospital intensivist. So first of all, a hospitalist is a doctor who works for the hospital. An intensivist is a hospitalist who works in the ICU. This particular hospital intensivist had 3 patients who were failing all medical treatment. He was willing to do anything to save them, and he had nothing more to offer them. So again, this is back in the days before IRBs, and so he calls in a faith healer. The faith healer does his thing, but the doctor didn't tell the patients. It's amazing he even did this, because he could be fired. He would certainly lose his credibility. But the interesting thing is there was no effect. The faith healer had no effect. But then he decides, okay. So he fires the faith healer, but he lies to the patients. And after firing the faith healer, he tells them, I've just brought in a world-renowned faith healer who's going to be working on your behalf. And after telling these patients that, they begin to get better, to feel better, and one of them even said she kind of could sense when the faith healer was working on her behalf. They recovered. So they didn't recover from the faith healer. They recovered from being told by the doctor that a faith healer was working for them. And a lot of people have gone to faith healers and gotten well. It works, but it's not usually the faith healer who's getting them well. It's the belief of the person in the faith healer. If you have absolute total trust in the faith healer, those are the people who can get well. Voodoo works in a similar way. A voodoo curse can be put on one of us. If we don't believe in voodoo, it's not going to have any effect. But if you're from a part of the world where people believe in voodoo and they're brought up with that, people die from voodoo curses. But they're dying from it's a cultural thing. It's the belief. So this was a study done with Parkinson's patients. When the Parkinson's patients believed the placebo they were receiving was the real drug, their brains synthesized as much dopamine as when given the active drug. So on the right you see a brain. Our brains are factories. Our brains are drug factories. It's a hell of a lot cheaper to access the brain, known as the endogenous pharmacy, than getting stuff from prescriptions. There was a study done at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston where they had a bunch of patients who were going into the hospital for knee surgery, arthroscopic knee surgery. And half of the patients got the real arthroscopic knee surgery. The other half had a hole made in the knee for the scope, but they didn't even insert the scope. So the half got the surgery, they were sewn up, sent home. The other half just had the hole made, they were sewn up, sent home. 2 years later, they discovered that the half that got the surgery and the half that got the sham surgery, they had the same results. Some had, their knees were all better, some the knees weren't better, but the proportion of people who had gotten the sham surgery was the same. I've been fascinated by this for years. People with schizophrenia and people with multiple personality disorder have, by some accounts, it varies, but by some accounts as much as 1/3 the amount of cancer as the rest of the population, which I find very intriguing because no one seems to have an answer for this. This is a woman, the names have been changed, but this is one person who has 3 personalities. So one of her personalities, she's 5 years old. When she is that personality, she acts like she's 5 years old. Kelly is shy, Megan is extrovert, Tara doesn't speak. It's all the same person, it's one person. Diabetes, no medical problems, blue eyes, brown eyes, hazel eyes, no allergies, right-handed, left-handed, 20/20 vision, nearsighted. I mean, imagine that. I don't have a clue how this works. It's their not only their physiology, their anatomy changes. And it's like that night I told you about when I was coming down with the flu and I had all the symptoms. They had already manifest. I wasn't trying to get well. I just knew, and that's the difference. I think that's what goes on here. Schizophrenics, people with multiple personality disorder, they're not consciously doing this. They actually, in their minds, become these other personalities. I mentioned William Osler earlier, this brilliant doctor. He was called to make a house call to this little boy. This is in England in the early 1900s, many decades before antibiotics. He makes a house call. He diagnoses this little boy with whooping cough, which before antibiotics was a deadly disease. It so happens that when he arrived, he had just come from commencement ceremonies at Oxford Medical School. So he was still dressed in his robes. The little boy, he could see that the little boy was really taken by the robes. The little boy had never seen such things. And the boy attributed that to that this doctor had magical healing powers. So he capitalized on that. When he was walking through the house, he noticed the mother had fresh peaches. So he asked her to slice a peach. And the doctor went back. Dr. Osler made house calls every day to this boy for a month and a half and sits on the boy's bed feeding him slices of freshly cut peach. Now imagine a doctor coming to your house, sitting on your bed, and hand feeding you slices of freshly cut peach. And he told the boy, this is a very special magical peach that has healing powers. And you know, kids have vivid imaginations, and the boy took it all in. And of course, Dr. Osler, every day for a month and a half, he remembered the effect that his robes had. So every day before going into the house, he would put on his robes. After a month and a half, the boy was cured. Now, maybe the boy would have been cured anyway. Not everyone died of whooping cough. Some, their immune systems fought it off. But it's an interesting case anyway. This woman had intractable asthma, and there was a pharmaceutical company that was testing a new, very powerful asthma medication they were very excited about. And this patient gets phenomenal results. The results were so good, they were even better than what the pharmaceutical industry thought. So the doctor figures it's got to be placebo because the drug couldn't have made her well this fast. So he plays a trick. He gives her a placebo. Now, it didn't say placebo. She really thought she was getting the real drug. But when she comes back for the next treatment, he gives her normal saline, a harmless substance that has no curative powers. And she comes back later saying it stopped working. So that convinces the doctor, oh, it must have been the power of the real drug. He's now convinced the drug is every bit that powerful. So he calls up the drug company to order more, and this is what he's told. That drug that he gave his patient that cured her, that made her well, was actually a placebo. So the question is, why did she get better? Well, any ideas why she got better the first time and not the second time? Both placebos? Yeah, I think that's true. So here's what I think happened. I think, so, you know, we think we learn from each other based on what we're saying, but the reality is, if you look at any textbooks on non-verbal communication, you learn that 95% of communication is non-verbal. Dogs are great. They can read us. They don't really understand our words. They read our body language. We're not very good at that because we see body language, but we're too busy. Our minds are too full of chatter. I think what happened was when the doctor gave her what he now knows is a placebo, his own placebo, he non-verbally communicated to her that I'm giving you a placebo. I'm not giving you the real drug. Even though he told her it's the real drug, I think she non-verbally, unconsciously picked up something from him. He was acting differently in some way. 244 breast cancer patients were asked how many people they confided in during the first 3 months after their surgery. 56% of those who hadn't confided in anyone were still alive after 7 years. 66% who had confided in one person were alive at 7 years. And 76% who confided in more than 2 people were still alive at 7 years. This is a study done at Johns Hopkins, 1,300 medical students, a really nice sample size, carried out for 30 years. So when they were in medical school, they were assessed, they were given some psychological instruments, some survey questionnaires and things to determine the quality of their relationships. The researchers, and it took 4 sets of researchers over the next 30 years to follow them, who got a hold of their medical records. And it turns out 30 years later, the doctors who, while in medical school, were determined to not be very good at maintaining relationships, just having troubled relationships, developed cancer over the 30-year period at 16 times the rate of those who were the most capable of having meaningful relationships. This is interesting. Friendlier people have better immune function. So when I saw this study, I thought, wow, I got to start, because I've always been very introverted, and it's hard for me to talk to strangers, but I started making an effort when I saw this study. This is Carmu. Carmu was a healer in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the 1970s. He may still be around. And this is Dr. David McClellan. You might be wondering what this has to do with Carmu, but David McClellan worked for he was a physician on staff at the Harvard Health Service. And he started hearing all these stories about how people were getting better results going to Carmu than going to the Harvard Health Service. Now, this was disturbing to him, that this healer could possibly be getting better results than the Harvard Health Service with all the top-notch Harvard physicians. So when he gets sick, he decides, okay, I'm going to try this guy out. He goes there, and this is his account of what happened. So I'll let you read that. Now, the most interesting thing I find here is he goes in to see Carmu, and how does Carmu treat him? He holds him in his arms like a baby. I mean, just picture these 2 big guys, and one is holding the other one in his arms like a baby. I have trouble even with that image. So he says, when I left his office, I didn't feel any different. Goes home, gets into bed. The next day, he's all better. That doesn't happen with the flu. So then a colleague of his decides, okay, I'm going to Carmu when I get sick, and he did. And he expected to be held like a baby also. But he goes to see Carmu, and Carmu apparently was a really legitimate healer, and he was very intuitive. He didn't treat everyone the same. So this other guy, Dr. Myron Boroshenko, goes to see him. He was, by the way, married to Joan Boroshenko at the time, who's more famous. Carmu says, go down to the end of the hall. He doesn't hold him like a baby at all. He says, go down to the end of the hall, fill the bathtub, take off your clothes, get in the tub, soak, and oh, by the way, and pour this bottle of blue liquid in. So he does that and soak for 30 minutes. So Dr. Boroshenko feels really silly. He's a medical doctor. I can't believe I'm doing this. What am I doing?
He gets out of the tub after 30 minutes. He can't get the blue off. It just seems indelible. And he just starts laughing hysterically because it's so absurd. But while he's laughing, he notices something very interesting. He's all better. He goes in there sick as a dog, and he's completely better. And Dr. David McClellan then did controlled trials. And they sent half of a large group of students to Carmu, and the other half went to the Harvard Health Service. So most of those treated at Harvard Health Clinic developed severe colds. None of the Carmu treated patients developed colds. You know, I always used to believe there's no such thing as healers. It's all in the mind. I'm having doubts now. I think maybe it's in the mind, but maybe it's, because I have trouble believing that these two doctors from Harvard could possibly believe in this healer. I'm going to leave you with this. I'm wrapping up now. It's just going to leave you with this final quote, which I think says it all. A quote by Franz Alexander, a physician from about 100 years ago. The fact that the mind rules the body is, in spite of its neglect by biology and medicine, the most fundamental fact which we know about the process of life. I want to thank you for your attention, and